In August 1927, a line was drawn across a map by men who had never walked the land they were dividing. The men who drew it worked in offices in London and New Delhi. They consulted census data, railway timetables, and irrigation charts. They did not consult the people who lived on either side of the line they were about to create. Within weeks, that line would tear apart villages, families, and a way of life that had existed for centuries. This is the story of what happened when that line reached one small railway town in Punjab, and the handful of people who stood between a community and total annihilation. For nearly 200 years, the British had governed India as a single territory, a vast subcontinent of more than 300 million people, speaking dozens of languages, practicing different faiths, living in patterns of coexistence that had been established long before any colonial power arrived. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs lived in mixed villages, often on the same street, sometimes in the same family through marriage. Neighbors shared wells, shared harvest festivals, shared the small debts and kindnesses that hold communities together across generations. The announcement of independence came with a catch. India would be split into two nations, one with a Hindu majority and one with a Muslim majority. The border, later known as the Radcliffe Line, named after the British lawyer who drew it, Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never visited India before and never returned after, was finalized only days before independence was declared. Most people living near that border did not know which country they would wake up in. The town of Sheikhupura sat almost exactly on that line. It was a modest town, a market center, a railway junction, a place where farmers came to sell grain and buy tools, where families had buried their dead for generations without ever imagining that the ground beneath them might one day belong to a different country. By the second week of August, word arrived that the town would fall on the Pakistani side. For the Muslim families who lived there, this meant safety. For the Hindu and Sikh families, many of whom had lived there for generations, whose grandfathers had built the houses they were living in, it meant they had days, sometimes hours, to leave everything behind. Trains became the only way out. Refugee trains ran in both directions across the new border, packed far beyond capacity, with people clinging to rooftops and doorways, clutching whatever they could carry. The platforms at every station were overwhelmed. Families were separated in the crush. Children were lost. These trains became targets. Armed groups on both sides of the new border attacked trains carrying the wrong religion, and entire compartments were sometimes found empty of life by the time they reached their destination. The violence spread faster than anyone had predicted, and the colonial administration that might once have contained it was already dismantling itself, handing over to governments that had not yet assembled the means to respond. In Sheikhupura, a retired railway signalman named Fateh Singh had spent 30 years working the line that ran through the town. He had joined the railway as a young man, worked his way from assistant signalman to senior controller of the Sheikhupura junction box, and knew every signal box, every siding, every delay pattern between Lahore and Amritsar. He knew the embankment grades, the culvert positions, the places where the track ran high above the surrounding ground, and the places where it dipped through cuttings in the earth. When the violence began, Fateh Singh was 61 years old, and by every measure of the world around him, his usefulness was finished. On the 17th of August, a mob gathered at the edge of the Hindu and Sikh quarter of Sheikhupura. Estimates from survivor accounts later collected by relief workers placed the number at several hundred armed men, carrying torches, swords, and a small number of firearms. The quarter they were moving toward was not large, a cluster of perhaps 50 homes arranged along three narrow lanes that backed against the railway embankment on the northern side. Inside the quarter were perhaps 20 families, mostly elderly residents, women, and children. The younger men of fighting age had already left days earlier, trying to reach Amritsar on foot through the open countryside, and had not been heard from since. Fateh Singh was one of 4 men left who could still hold a weapon. The other 3 were his nephew Balwant, a young man of 22 who had been waiting to leave when his uncle refused to go without the families who could not travel on their own. A shopkeeper named Jogandar, who had stayed behind to try to recover some of his inventory and found himself still there when the roads became impassable, and an elderly tailor who had served briefly in the army decades before, during the First War, and still kept his old service revolver in a tin box beneath his cot. Between them, they had 2 old shotguns, that service revolver, and whatever could be turned into a weapon from farming tools and workshop equipment. The quarter itself was not built for defense, but it had one advantage that Fateh Singh understood better than anyone else in the town. The houses backed onto the railway embankment, a raised earthen wall nearly 15 feet high in places that ran behind the entire row of homes, built decades earlier to keep the tracks above flood level during the monsoon. The embankment was steep-sided, based with compacted gravel and clay, and the only crossing points at ground level were two narrow culverts where seasonal water drained beneath the line. Everything else was a difficult climb up loose gravel in the dark. When the mob began moving toward the quarter from the main road, Fede Singh did not wait inside the houses. He moved the remaining families up onto the embankment itself, into the drainage culverts, and behind the rail ballast along the track bed, using the high ground the way he had used signal boxes for 30 years, as a place to see everything and be seen by nothing. The first wave of the mob entered the empty houses, expecting to find people sheltering inside. They found nothing. While they searched room to room, shouting and setting fire to thatched roofs, the families above them on the embankment stayed silent in the gathering smoke. It was the smoke that nearly ended everything. The wind shifted, and the fires set in the houses below began spreading up the dry grass of the embankment itself. Children began coughing. A baby began to cry, and from below a man's voice called out that there was movement on the embankment. This was the moment Feda Singh had been waiting for, and the moment he had feared. The mob began climbing toward the drainage culverts from both directions at once, cutting off any retreat along the embankment. The four armed men were now spread across roughly 200 meters of high ground, with families sheltering in two separate culverts and an advancing crowd on both sides. Uginder, positioned at the eastern culvert, fired the first shot, not into the crowd but into the air. It was a warning, and for a moment it worked. The advancing line paused. Men looked at each other. The sound of a firearm in the darkness, on ground nobody could clearly see. It was enough to hesitate. But behind that line were men who had already burned 3 other quarters that week and had not been stopped by anything. The pause did not last. What followed has been described in post-war testimony as nearly 2 hours of fighting in failing light, fought not as a battle in any military sense, but as a series of desperate stands at narrow choke points. The drainage culverts, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass through, became the only places where the defenders could hold a line. Every time the crowd tried to push through, they funneled into a space no wider than a doorway, facing men who had nothing left to lose. The tailor, the oldest of the 4, was wounded early, a blow to the shoulder from a thrown brick that broke his collarbone. Ugh. He continued loading the revolver with one hand for the remainder of the fight, bracing it against his knee, passing it to Feda Singh's nephew between exchanges. As darkness fell fully over the town, something happened that none of the survivors could fully explain afterward. The mob, which had numbered in the hundreds at the start of the evening, began to thin. Groups of men drifted away from the base of the embankment. Some accounts suggest that word had reached the crowd of a military patrol moving along the main road from Sheikhupura station, sent in response to reports of fires visible for miles against the night sky. Others suggest simply that darkness made the embankment too dangerous to assault, with defenders who knew every inch of it firing from positions the attackers could not locate. Whatever the reason, the pressure eased, slowly, and then all at once. By the time full night settled over the town, the mob had withdrawn from the embankment entirely, though the houses below continued to burn through the night. When the families came down from the embankment the next morning, the quarter they had lived in no longer existed. Every house had been burned to its foundations. The lanes between them were filled with ash and the debris of everything that could not be carried. But of the roughly 80 people who had taken shelter on the embankment that evening, 76 were still alive. 4 had died, 3 from smoke inhalation in the culverts, and 1 elderly woman from a heart attack during the worst hours of the fighting. Not one person had been killed by the mob directly during the assault on the embankment itself. The 4 defenders survived the night. Bate Singh, the signalman who had spent 30 years reading the railway line like a second language, lived for another 11 years, eventually resettling in Amritsar with members of his extended family, working briefly as a station porter before his health declined. He rarely spoke about that night. According to his grandson, who later gave testimony to a regional oral history project documenting partition survivors in the 1990s, Feda Singh said only once that the embankment had always been his friend, and that on that night it simply kept its word. What happened at Sheikhupura that night was never recorded in any official history of partition. No government report mentions it. No newspaper of the time carried the story. It exists only because a handful of survivors lived long enough to tell their grandchildren, and because, decades later, someone thought to ask. Across the new border that summer, an estimated 1 to 2 million people died in the violence of partition, and somewhere between 10 and 20 million were displaced, the largest mass migration in human history outside of an active war. Most of those people have no recorded names. Most of their stories were never written down. The scale of what happened was too vast, and the new governments on both sides were too overwhelmed and later too invested in their own national narratives to preserve what actually occurred in the lanes and fields and railway embankments where ordinary people made impossible decisions in the dark. The embankment in Sheikhupura still stands today, carrying freight trains across what is now Pakistani Punjab. Most of the people who pass over it have no idea what happened on the ground beneath the tracks. On one night in August 1947, when four men with two shotguns, a revolver, and a railway worker's knowledge of high ground held a line long enough for 76 people to see the morning. History remembers what power allows it to remember. This is one of the moments it almost did not.